Testing. Okay, there. I am seeing my mic. Okay. Looks like it was a little bit quiet. All right. So last time we were talking about cycling of matter inside of the in the environment, and we had mentioned the carbon cycle. So this is the idea that carbon from the air, so carbon in the air, goes into plants. Goes into plants through photosynthesis. And then those plants put the carbon into animals. Usually we draw a little bunny or something here. You know, just the season, I guess, for bunnies. And so they go into the animals. Those animals go into other animals. Through the trophic levels that we discussed at an earlier date. And this is a really good use of my time here, is to draw these animals. Okay. So they go into other animals, and then the carbon also can leave those animals through breathing. So through respiration, that carbon can go back into the air. And then eventually these animals also die, and so they go into bacteria. Let's put some little bacteria here. Or into worms and other decomposers. Maybe like a bug. This one's a bug, not a bacterium. Whatever, something like that. So they go into the decomposers, who also return the carbon back into the air. So that's sort of the cycle that we're talking about. We're talking about how all the things that make us up, all of the carbon that we think of as just being something we breathe in, that does eventually get into our bodies through this cycle. It also gets out of our bodies through the cycle, and it's the circle of life, as Mufasa said, and all that sort of thing. From Lion King. So that's life, right? That's the carbon cycle. Now there are some problems. Is that carbon does have in our chemistry unit? We talked about how carbon does have some byproducts. It can be converted into things like H2CO3 by adding water. And so when there's lots and lots of carbon in the air, then this can come back down as acid precipitation. Precip. I'm going to write that nicer, just one second. And so that's one of the ways it gets in. And of course, one of the problems is that even though we have this nice cycle, there is the human component. If we drop a little factory in here, well, factories take the carbon that's out of the ground and they burn it up and turn it into CO2 as well. So that's so combustion also produces CO2. When we have the more CO2 we have, as we bring up the amount of CO2, the more we see the conversion to H2CO3. And that's bad news, because that means more acid rain. All right, and so that's the release. So that's probably something that's missing from this picture, is we don't have a industrial component, but we do see that in this second global carbon cycle diagram. And you can see here that we have the input of sunlight. Whew. Morning classes, I tell you. So the input of sunlight into the land. This goes into land biota. That's like land plants and animals. Goes into those, feeds them, allows them to respire, And then together they form through photosynthesis an amount of soil and detritus. This is carbon-based soil and detritus. So that's like debris and carbon. And then that's about 1,600 per year. What is that? Probably tons, gigatons of carbon. And so that carbon then gets put in through deforestation to be burned and converted into various fuel sources, or even just used as in the industry. Uh, coal, oil, and gas, they produce about 5,000 to 10,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide or carbon. And so, yeah, not sure if I'm following this diagram so much. We do see that there's a whole bunch of carbon that's stored in the ocean. This one is a really interesting one. So I do have something to say about that. In the ocean, there is dissolved CO2. So as the water heats up, as water is heated, the CO2 will be released. So this is one of the reasons that you really want to drink your Coke or your pop very, very cold, because cold pop has more CO2 in it. The hotter you warm up your pop, the more fizzy it will be, and that's partly because the hotter the water is, the less it can hold the carbon dioxide. Well, this applies to ocean because the ocean is also water. And so the warmer we heat our oceans, the less water that the ocean will be able to hold, or the less CO2 the ocean will be able to hold. And that's going to be bad news. And that's already something that's happening, and something that scientists are concerned about is that if we are not careful and we allow for global warming to occur, then we will end up causing the warm water to heat up, or the ocean heat up, and then this 38,000 gigatons of carbon will not be 38,000 gigatons of carbon anymore. There will be a sudden release of carbon, of CO2 carbon, once we hit that threshold of warm water. And that warm carbon dioxide is going to come out of the water, and it's going to join the atmosphere. And we have not talked about the greenhouse effect, which we will talk about in our weather unit, but the one problem with CO2 is that once you have extra CO2 in the air, it forms sort of an insulating barrier, and the heat of the ocean gets bounced back by the CO2, and that's called the greenhouse effect. And that greenhouse effect will be enhanced once this water heats up and all that CO2 is released. So I'm sure we'll talk more about that when we get into the weather unit, where we'll talk about global warming and climate change. So hopefully you've had a little bit of time to contemplate these questions here. Let's answer one of them just as a little review of what we did last 2 weeks ago. So why is photosynthesis and cellular respiration considered complementary? Well, photosynthesis creates CO2, creates sugar from CO2 and water, and cellular respiration, consumes sugar and makes CO2 and H2O. And so that's what complementary means here, is that one produces what the other needs. So animals produce what the plants need, plants produce what the animals need, and bacteria kind of fill in all the gaps in between. What is the importance of decomposers in the carbon cycle? Well, these are the decomposers. They break down dead material so that the carbon in it can rejoin the carbon cycle. The oceans are a carbon reservoir. In what ways is carbon held in the ocean? Well, there's a couple ways. I don't know if I don't think you have any notes on this. You might have had to look this up. But one of the ways is what I described just a minute ago. There's dissolved carbon carbon molecules like CO2 and others. We also have carbon in the form of animals. Carbon in the form of living organisms, plants, animals, etc. As we'll discuss in a later biology class, not this one, we scientists consider there to be at least 3 to 7 different types of organisms out there. There's the plants, the animals, the funguses. There's something called a protist or a protozoan and a chromista. And there's also bacterias and another some similar thing to a bacteria called an archaean. So all the different living organisms, of course, are made of carbon. So any of those in there. And then we also have dead organisms, and pollution. Dead organisms, oil reserves, and pollution, like plastics, all carry carbon in the oceans. So there's lots of carbon going on in those oceans. We've got lots of different options there, but certainly thinking about dead organisms, all the things you might not, you might have to think, anything that we put into the ocean is going to have carbon in it for the most part, and other things. How does burning fossil fuels affect the carbon cycle? Well, burning fossil fuels takes carbon that was stored in those fuels and injects and puts them into the atmosphere, where they can join the cycle. This carbon would have not really been a part cycle otherwise. Not really, would not have been part of the cycle otherwise. Yeah, so this is the big thing about burning fossil fuels. There is some burning of fuels by natural causes like volcanoes and things like that. But in general, when human beings get in there and they burn these fossil fuels, they are causing a huge injection of carbon that would not have been a part of the process otherwise. And so, it's not great. Let's just say that it's not great. The cycle itself is, cycles suggest some sort of consistency or some sort of balance, And when human beings burn those fossil fuels, we unbalance the cycle, and it puts strain on other parts of it, like our climate, like the global temperature. Why is carbon cycle more quickly? Why is carbon cycled more quickly through tropical ecosystems than in northern ecosystems? This is a really interesting question. In this case, we have to think about where does carbon get put into the cycle naturally, and that would be through plants. Uh, and other living organisms. So living organisms are more uh, dense in tropical ecosystems. More biological organisms per area. So you just simply have a density issue. So this is you know thinking about coronavirus and how fast coronavirus is spread in some countries versus others. A lot of this has been because of a dependence on density. So when you get the population density up, then things spread. Same thing with a carbon cycle. The more the higher the density, the higher the spread, fastest spread of carbon. How we're burning the rainforest to clear land for farming. People are burning rainforests to clear land for farming. How could the loss of these trees affect the oxygen CO2 levels in the atmosphere? So hopefully you can say something like those trees provide oxygen and consume CO2. So we expect that after the trees have been removed, CO2 levels will increase and O2 decrease. That's odd. We should really, the question's the same. CO2 increases. We should probably change that first question so it's only about oxygen. Okay. Here's a completing the cycle image. I think you can just use a reference point there. But if not, you can also find this online and fill it in. Okay, I will fill that in and post it afterwards. So we talked a little bit about acid rain. We had a question in the chat on the Google Hangout, and if you're not on the Hangout yet, please get in there about how could sulfurs cause could cause acid rain. I believe this was actually brought up in our previous chemistry unit. I have a feeling that my pen is dead. Let's see. And that is the idea that these sulfur molecules or sulfur oxides, usually something like SO2, can be released into the air. And when it is released into the air, it can find, or maybe it's SO3. Let's start with SO3. If it finds a water molecule, then it can combine with that water molecule to make H2SO4, which is an acid. This is sulfuric acid. So that's where this can happen. So when we make sulfur oxides like these, they mix with water and form sulfuric acid. And that's of course not great. Sulfuric acids are bad news. Very strong acids, much stronger than the carbonic acid we've been talking about up until now, the H2CO3 or bicarbonate. So yeah, it's nasty stuff there. And we talked about the damage the other day. So one thing that we can do is we can burn cleaner fuels. This is the idea that if you could prepare your fuel ahead of time, you might be able to remove some of the sulfur. So remove sulfur from the coal. Um, this is one of the things that they're using right now. That there are lots of coal plants that are still being used for energy, even in the States and uh, all across the world. Coal in general is a very cheap fuel to find. You can just dig it right out of the ground and start burning it. But through proper preparation of that coal fuel, you can remove a lot of the sulfur, and then that will reduce the chance of forming acid rain because you'll have less sulfur in the air. Um, So nitrogen oxides are also possible. Nitrogen oxides also form when we burn things. So cars and trucks, they produce a lot of nitrogen oxides. So we're talking about now something like NO. Let's go like NO. Let me try to think about NO. Yeah, and then whatever. We're gonna mix it with water, and we're gonna get HNO3. And that's not balanced, so I need two of those and two of those. I'm trying to balance out a chemical equation here. That's 2 and 1, and that's 6. Ooh, not balanced. Okay. Should I give you just bonus points for balancing this equation? Looks like I'll have to go something like this so that I can balance it. That gives me 12 oxygens and 4 of these. That's 4 oxygens and 6 oxygens on the left. So I just need 3 O2 molecules. There we go. Just had to cheat a little bit. Okay, so if we have nitrogen oxides coming from our cars, so these are coming from the cars, and those can combine with water, and that can form nitric acid. So this is nitric acid. So they can get some really acidic rain in highly industrialized cities and regions, places like even like Hamilton, Toronto, Montreal. Manitoba has a benefit of being in the prairies. So here's a little blurb about that. So the problem is different in the prairies. In the prairies, there is not as much pollution and not as much rain. But we do have some industries that pollute, especially the oil and fuel industries in Alberta. So the same oxides are in prairie dust, just not in the snow. When that dust settles, the chemicals sit there until the next rainfall. And when they get wet, they turn into acid and they do damage to crops and forests and cars and other surfaces. So we don't actually have uh, precipitation, we have deposition. This dust, these solid particles in the air, they fall on everything around us, and including all of our farmlands and our soils and our forests. And then when it rains, that dust suddenly becomes dangerous and causes damage to those areas. So that's the way it happens in the prairies. So what is acid rain? What chemicals behind its formation? We've discussed 3 chemicals that are in acid rain. Acid rain a is when a chemical reaction in the atmosphere creates acid molecules acid molecules inside the rain drops. 3 possible chemicals: carbon oxides, nitrogen oxides, and sulfur. Sulfur, yeah, sulfur, thank you. Sulfur oxides can form acid rain. What part of the carbon cycle has the greatest impact on the formation of acid rain? I guess combustion of fossil fuels has the largest impact, since it can release all 3 types of oxides. Okay. So the last cycle that we talked about, or that we got started talking about, I feel like we had a little bit of a fast end on the last class. So this was the nitrogen cycle, really, really important cycle. This is where nitrogen in the gas, which is a gas in the atmosphere, a very stable gas in the atmosphere, but is necessary for living things. For that nitrogen to enter our bodies, it needs to change form. And so the form we want is something called a nitrate, which is usually written like this. You can actually find this on the back of your periodic table, nitrates. And this conversion is called a nitrogen fixing. And nitrogen fixing is usually done by nitrogen fixing bacteria or by lightning. Lightning's the more rare. So lightning uses the energy from lightning, reacts with the O2 and N2 to make nitrates. Those nitrates can dissolve in the water. They're absorbed by plant roots, and then those plants will use them to make DNA and protein. Animals can eat those plants and use the proteins to make their own proteins, and the DNA to make their own DNA. The other form of nitrogen fixing is done by bacteria, and this is probably the more common form. So nitrogen fixing bacteria, they are found in most ecosystems. They are they're the special bacteria, and they live in the soil. They can also be found in little lumps on the roots of legumes. So a legume is a pea or a bean or a clover or an alfalfa. And these plants make sugar for the bacteria, and the bacteria provides nitrates for the plants. The bacteria make more nitrate than they need, and the excess goes into the soil. This is an example of what we call coevolution in biological evolutionary theory, is the idea that we have this sort of symbiotic relationship between the bacteria and the plant. So that's a relationship that would have developed over the last I don't know, a couple million years or so, 100 million years. The other plants must get their nitrates from the soil, and then fertilizers contain nitrates as well that help plants grow. So remember that one of the sources of fertilizer is through dung or through droppings, right? And so that is because the nitrogen in those fertilizers, so nitrogen and fertilizer is usually from the digestion of other organisms. So I would like to think about you making an extension here. Um, think about that whole idea of nitrogen and nitrogen reacting with water, right? What would happen if a nitrate reacted with water? Well, nitrates reacting with water would be very similar to the acid rain reaction. And so this is one of the reasons that fertilizers can be both good or bad for your lawn or for your garden. Nitrogen-bearing fertilizers contain nitrates. Those nitrates could react with water to form nitric acid. So if you apply too much fertilizer to your lawn or to your garden, you might end up killing your garden because you have just dropped a whole bunch of nitrogen on there, and then that nitrogen will be acidic. Your plants do need some fertilizer. They do need some plants do need fertilizer. They don't have enough nitrogen themselves, but this is one of the reasons why there are special fertilizers for different organisms for different plants. And also why dung and or droppings or whatever work really well as fertilizers, because that they are digesting other organisms. Those organisms contain fertilizer, and so that becomes that nitrogen can become part of uh, the fertilizer mixture. So mixed planting is a really effective choice here. So that is a practice that has been used for thousands and thousands of years to encourage the soil to be replenished by things like legumes. Excuse me. Did I put a Three Sisters picture in here? I did not. Let's see if I can grab one real quick. Oh, I do have a picture. Okay, that is the picture. So yeah, so that's where I put this picture, yes, on a couple weeks ago. So here we have the Three Sisters, and the beans here are providing the necessary nitrogen for the soil. You can see them wrapped around. It's probably not super clear for you, but the beans are here wrapped around the maize, wrapped around the corn. The corn here is using the nitrogen, so it uses up some of the extra nitrogen, and then the squash provides protection from some of the bigger organisms like raccoons and things. So that's how the Three Sisters works. A beautiful example of sort of engineering, I guess. Farming engineering. Farm engineering is a form of engineering, and it's one that human beings have been engaged in and for a long, long time. Okay, nitrogen and decomposers. So these are where we get nitrogen back into the soil. So bacteria can convert proteins and DNA into ammonia, also another basic compound. So ammonia is a base. So other bacteria can also turn ammonia into nitrites, and other bacteria can convert nitrites into nitrates. So then those nitrates can be used by the plants all over again. Note that these good bacteria need oxygen to live. So this is a key point that we're going to come back to in a second. So all of these good bacteria that convert ammonia. So think about this. If you want to go from ammonia all the way over to nitrite, which is like NO2, I think, and then all the way to NO3, well, you need to get some oxygen in there. So here we're going to put some oxygen, and we're going to get out. We better write these nicely because we just finished that whole unit on how to write chemical equations. So oxygen plus ammonia will form NO2 minus plus water, I believe. Or is it hydrogen gas? Well, hydrogen gas will be easier to get rid of. I can balance it. Okay. So let's just think. We got to get 3 of those, which means we probably have to go with 6. So I'm going to go 6 here to keep the numbers even. 6 means that's 12, so that means 4 of those. 4 of those means 4 of these. That gives me 8 oxygens plus another 6 oxygens. So that's 8 and 6 is 14 oxygens. So I need 7 oxygens over here. So you can see that you actually need quite a bit of oxygen to power this conversion to NO2 minus. And then that NO2 minus is, which is the nitrate, NO2 to nitrate, NO3. This nitrite plus oxygen will give us something like 2, I want to make 2 NO3s. That gives me 6 oxygens and 4. Yeah, so that's right. And then I only need a little bit more oxygen, but I still do need oxygen to make that last conversion. So yeah, from in that perspective, we have to be a little bit, we have to think about our soil and think about how does oxygen get into our soil? What are some ways that we get oxygen into our soil? If you lived on a farm or you know anything about farming, one of the first things you'll do at the beginning of a season is probably till the soil. You'll turn the soil over, you move it around, get in there and turn that soil up and down and move it around, and that's all in the name of getting oxygen in there. And then later on, if you think about your yard, you might aerate your yard. And if you aerate your yard, you punch holes in the ground, and that will help oxygen get down into the soil, and then it'll enrich the soil from this bacteria that is breaking down ammonia and dead organisms and things. And you probably have like dead leaves on your yard or whatever. Now, if there's no oxygen, then some of the bacteria will actually steal the oxygen away from the nitrogen to form ammonia again and to form nitrogen gas. So, and then this nitrogen gas goes back into the environment, and those organisms will be depleting it. These are the bad bacteria, and they do not need oxygen. So we call these good bacteria are known as aerobic bacteria, bacteria, bacteria. And then these ones, the bad ones, are known as anaerobic bacteria. I apologize, this really should have had like sort of an indicator on it that it's a sort of a different section. So old lawns can have a poor oxygen supply because of the hard soil, the sod on top of the lawn is very thick, and it doesn't let a lot of oxygen through. So there can be lots of bad bacteria, and then your lawn will start to die or start to run out of nitrogen in it because it doesn't have a lot of oxygen getting down to the bottom, to the under the ground. If you aerate your lawn, you'll discourage these bacteria and encourage the happy nitrogen-making bacteria. So that'll provide nitrates, making your lawn greener. Same thing with your plants at home. If you have plants on the inside, you can stir up the soil a little bit, or you can punch holes in it to get some oxygen down to the lower areas, more closer to the roots. The nitrates are needed to make chlorophyll, which is our green color in our plants, and if we have acidic conditions, then the denitrification increases. So bogs and other sort of other acidic environments like that have low nitrogen versus other environments that have high nitrogen. There are a few kinds of plants that live in bogs, but those that do often rely on dead animals as a nitrogen source. And that's where we have the Venus flytrap is found in the North American bogs. And that's one of those plants that eats flies for nitrogen. And that's why it does that. That's always really interesting. We have a couple of examples of plants in Manitoba that also that are also carnivorous, looking for, not for energy so much, but for nitrogen by eating the occasional bug. So here's that cycle. You can see the atmospheric nitrogen here. It's moving down into the ground where nitrogen fixing bacteria are converting it into forms that the nitrogen this is going straight through, right? So this is nitrogen right into nitrates. I'll just put a little. This is N2 going in. These are NO3 going out and straight into the roots. Then you have your nitrogen fixing bacteria, which are taking your nitrogen that's dissolved and turning it into ammonia. Ammonia has two sort of forms. It has an NH3 form or NH4. Both are valid. NH4 is when it reacts with water. That ammonium is going to react with the nitrification bacteria, forming nitrates. Those nitrites will react with nitrates, which will allow it to assimilate into plants. But those nitrates under denitrifying bacteria will form nitrogen gas, and that will be bad. And the decomposers can take all of those plants and break anything dead and can break it down into NH4. Okay, so we have some nitrogen cycle questions. I'll go through those a little later. I just want to cycle forward. Maybe I will do that one today, and then we'll do bioaccumulation tomorrow. So let's just go through these questions quickly today, and then we will be done for the day. So why is nitrogen important in organisms? We need it to form protein and DNA. That's really the key point. Those are the two things that you really need it for. If you can't form those, you can't form life. Proteins do all of the work in your cell's body. It is the reason that your cell can function, and DNA is what you need to make those proteins. If there's about 79% nitrogen in the atmosphere, how can some soils have a shortage of nitrogen? Well, the nitrogen in the atmospheric N2 is not a form of nitrogen that organisms can use. It must be in the form of NO3 nitrates, which requires bacteria fixing or lightning fixing. Lightning fixing is by far the less common one, but it is still a valid option. And how do animals get usable nitrogen? We get it from bacteria, from nitrogen fixing. Oh, actually, sorry, animals. Animals absorb the nitrogen when they eat other organisms. Explain how bacteria in the roots of beans help the plants grow, help the plant, and how the plant helps the bacteria. So bacteria on the roots of legumes produce nitrates for the plant, and the plant produces sugars in their roots that the bacteria can eat. Draw a nitrogen cycle for a farm or a garden in which manure is used. So this is always fun. So if you had manure, let's say you're getting your manure from, let's give it a cow here. cow. So we do have a little bit of manure here. All right, so nitrogen, and let's give ourselves a plant here. Let's give some grass. And then we've got our soil. And we're going to put some bacteria down here. So the nitrogen is in the air. The nitrogen goes into the soil. Some of that nitrogen goes straight into the plant through nitrogen fixing. And then some of it also goes through other bacteria till it forms nitrates through the other nitrogen bacteria, the aerobic bacteria, and then into the plants. These plants go into the animal. The animal puts the plant into its manure, and then that manure works as soil food, which goes back into the plants. So that's one of the ways that we can get that manure is useful, is that the organism, the animal body, is not 100% efficient. So some of that protein that they chomp down on has to be put out as waste products, and in that waste products there's going to be nitrogens. Why is it a good idea to aerate your lawn? We discussed this earlier, that the aerobic bacteria that form nitrates in the soil require oxygen. Plants, farmers sometimes plant corn along with alfalfa. Corn is worth a lot of money, but a lot more money on the market than alfalfa. What's the advantage? Alfalfa is a legume, so it has nitrogen fixing bacteria on its roots, which keep the soil rich and feed the corn plants. Well, let's say, and keep the corn plants. And keep the corn plants healthy. With each grain harvest, nitrogen is removed from the soil. Farmers traditionally rotate the crops, planting legumes in alternate years by using nitrogen-rich fertilizers. By using nitrogen-rich fertilizers, many farmers have abandoned crop rotation. What advantages are gained by fertilizers? So fertilizers can be a direct source of nitrogen. So the soil can be, what do we say? The soil can be made fertile, again, by adding fertilizers instead of the natural legumes. New strains of crops produce more grain, but use high levels of nitrogen. What are some long-term disadvantages these crops might present in ecosystems? So using up too much nitrogen from the soil will require more fertilizers. Excess fertilizer can become run off the water supply. So one of the problems with fertilizers is that if there's extra fertilizer, then that fertilizer can enter your water supply. It can run down the stream and actually join in with larger water bodies like say a lake. And nitrogen is necessary for plant growth. Well, plants do use up some oxygen in a they use up some oxygen for breathing in a water uh, in in the water. So when you have a lot of plants growing from the extra nitrogen that's around, then they can actually start to use up some of that extra oxygen. That's another way that that algae blooms and things like that can happen. It's from too much nitrogen available. Nitrogen also is also potentially acidic, so extra nitrogen can make nearby water sources acidic, which is dangerous for the fish in those environments. I feel like there's one more. I can't. What is the other danger? Oh yeah, to produce fertilizers, uh, there is a large energy cost. So more, um, more greenhouse gases. So this is always an interesting idea, like if you are going to be making plants that require more nitrogen and you're going to feed that nitrogen to them with fertilizer, then you're going to actually have to make more fertilizer. Well, fertilizer is not free to make. It's actually quite challenging and quite energetically intense. So you're going to be putting a lot of energy in to make that fertilizer. That energy is coming from somewhere, probably from a power plant. That power plant's releasing that energy into the environment or releasing waste into the environment as probably CO2. So another problem that you think you're eating plants and it's all good, but if those plants require lots of nitrogen, then you could actually be producing a lot of CO2. And with that, we're going to be wrapping up for today. There's another chart here, but hopefully you can follow that one. Maybe I'll fill it in and post it on the classroom. With that, we will come back. It looks like we still have two classes of two live streams left for ecology, and then you can focus in on those physics ones. I'll try to give you some break after this. I won't be posting as much, and we'll leave Matthew to do the posting. So otherwise, have a great day. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them into the Google Hangout, and we'll talk to you there. All right, have a great day.